Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt, still hiding out down here in the catacombs. The Vatican is in the news this week, and things are going from bad to worse. The Vatican, I think it can fairly be said, is no longer, obviously at least, under the charge of those who are practicing Catholics. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I do believe we've come very close to that point. I'm not sure what they are, but their Catholicity grows more suspect by the day.
Images of clouds, lions, and butterflies alternating with polluted air and parched farmland were projected on the famous facade of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican on Tuesday night as global leaders try to thrash out a historic climate deal in Paris.
And I don't know how else to describe what they're doing with our church, other than they're taking it to a place that is no longer Catholic. Now, thank God, we're not the only ones. For 50 years, we've been kind of alone, not we as in the remnant, but traditionalists have been more or less alone, trying to point out that something has gone terribly wrong in the church. Well, that, at least, Francis has ended those days. Now it's not just the rad trads who are pointing this out. We're not the only ones at a loss for how to deal with this pontificate of Pope Francis. Now we have 4 cardinals, thanks be to God. Really 5 if you consider Cardinal Pell, who seems to be throwing in behind the 4 cardinals. And these men are opposing Pope Francis's attempt to let public adulterers receive Holy Communion. I hate to even say that again because we're all getting used to hearing it. The Pope wants to let public adulterers receive Holy Communion. You can't really even believe. You got to slow down and think about that. That this is what the issue is right now. This is what we're all wrestling with. Thank God for those cardinals, and also now the cardinals, because they are in leadership positions in the church, I think they're encouraging a lot of less powerful churchmen to step forward. So we've got several bishops now weighing in support of Cardinal Burke and the other 3 cardinals. Francis must be stopped is the message. The great Bishop Athanasius Schneider, for example, publicized his defense for Cardinal Burke and company this week, saying, quote, "The 4 cardinals, with their prophetic voice demanding doctrinal and pastoral clarity, have a great merit before their own conscience, before history, and before innumerable simple, faithful Catholics of our day, who are driven to the ecclesiastical periphery because of their fidelity to Christ's teaching about the indissolubility of marriage," end quote. Of course, the Vatican, which never ceases to extol the merits of dialogue and tolerance with Hottentots and who knows what else all around the world who aren't Catholic or Christian or anything else, this Vatican wants nothing to do with dialogue now when it comes to the 4 cardinals. They want nothing to do with dialoguing with this growing group of faithful churchmen whose Catholic consciences, well-formed consciences, prohibit them from just sitting back and saying, well, we'll just see what happens. So the Vatican this week thunders silence through the Dean of the Roman Rota, Archbishop Pio Vito Pinto, the top canonical court overseeing marriage, warning Cardinal Burke from the Vatican this week for causing, according to this Archbishop, for causing grave scandal. Grave scandal. Now we're talking about allowing public adulterers to receive Holy Communion without repentance. That's not scandalous. But for a cardinal to ask questions about changing the church's rule on this, that, according to this modern Vatican, is going to give grave scandal, because the faithful cardinal dared to raise his voice with questions. And remember this, questions. He's raising questions. He's not making accusations, Cardinal Burke, raising questions that Francis refuses to answer. What about dialogue? What about the church of accompaniment? Why isn't the modern Vatican, why aren't they worrying about accompanying faithful princes of the church who have questions about the way things are going right now? So, Cardinal Burke and company, welcome to the Archbishop Lefebvre Club of Faithful Princes of the Church, who in conscience couldn't just sit back and say nothing against the destruction of the church at the hands of modernists in Rome. This has been going on for a long time. Again, Pope Francis is the ultimate Pope of Vatican II, although I don't think he gives a rip about Vatican II anymore. It's too conservative for him. He is on the logical continuum of Vatican II. He's just tearing everything down. I don't expect Archbishop Pio Vito to be a Thomist, of course, being a modern, churchman. But what he says flies right in the face of St. Thomas Aquinas, who writes, of course, quote, "There being an imminent danger for the faith, prelates must be questioned, even publicly, by their subjects. And prelates, indeed, an example of humility that they not disdain corrections from those who are lower and subject to them. Subjects have an example of zeal and freedom, that they fear not to correct their prelates, particularly if their crime is public and verges on danger to the multitude. Now, when you think about this, in light of what the church teaches about resisting an authority who has gone astray, and Pope Francis ignoring these men, refusing to answer their questions, in all due respect to the office and to Francis himself, doesn't this refusal to dialogue with the four cardinals suggest an arrogance impossible to reconcile with Pope Francis the Humble that we see on the television? It's not just traditionalists speaking out anymore on these things. Cardinals, bishops, and scores of priests are asking questions, and the Holy Father is ignoring them, is refusing. He's just pushing ahead, forgetting all about the scandal that's coming about because of how he's doing this. After a papal airplane interview with the press, in which Pope Francis said that proselytism among Christians in itself is a grave sin, Father Brian Harrison, certainly again no rad trad, has had enough. And in the Remnant over at remnantnewspaper.com, he wrote a letter that says the following, quote, "It would be hard to conceive of a more superficial, more puerile remark on relations with other Christian denominations." Father Harrison says, "How much lower can the papacy sink in terms of both cheap jibes that demean and dishonor the supreme office of Christ's vicar on earth, lambasting an opposing position with a crude straw man caricature that would discredit a junior high schooler, and outright heterodoxy? I myself," says Father Harrison, "am a convert from Presbyterianism. I became a Catholic in order to save my soul. The Catholic faith I have professed now for 42 years is the most precious gift I have received. And now the head of Christ's Catholic Church on earth, no less, is telling me that those Catholics who by personal conversation and written argument help persuade me to abandon my Protestant heresies and embrace the fullness of revealed truth were thereby committing grave sin." And the Pope is justifying this excoriation of convert seeking with a vapid explanation that explains nothing. He says because it contradicts the very dynamic of how to become and how to remain Christian. How many previous successors of St. Peter must be rolling in their graves at such comments? This coming from a pope is outrageous, mind-boggling, unspeakable, incredible. It's the stuff of nightmare, end quote. So says Father Brian Harrison. Now, even if you agree with Pope Francis on this issue, you've got to admit that the way he's going about it is extremely destructive. And when his words cause such horrified, scandaled reaction, as we just saw from Father Harrison, coming from his own priests, the Pope needs to restate them. He needs to offer a clarification. He needs to offer an apology for scandalizing his priests and bishops and cardinals. Instead, he's silent. He's refusing to answer them. This is a case of the shepherd scandalizing the sheep. And what are we supposed to do? Observe respectful silence just because he's the shepherd? The shepherd seems to have gone off his rocker right now. So, this is where we stand. And yet in the face of this, incredibly, the vast majority of dumbed-down Catholics, subject to 50 years of conciliarism, of Vatican II, watered-down Catholicism, the vast majority of our co-religionists would tell us to chill out. Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Brandmuller, Bishop Schneider, Father Harrison, they all need to relax. They need to take a chill pill. But the question is, for how long do we relax? How long are we faithful Catholics supposed to avoid scandal by allowing the shepherds to scandalize the entire world with their antics and their statements and their efforts to water down theology or ignore it altogether? You think it's bad now? Just wait a year. Wait for the next synod in Rome, when they will give the papal blessing to homosexual unions. That's my prediction. Rob, you got that right down here from the catacombs? I was sitting right there in the Vatican's press hall in Rome last year when Cardinal Peter Turkson promised the press corps that the next year's synod would tackle gay unions and how gays and lesbians will be integrated into the church of accompaniment. You can stay in denial for just as long as you please, but understand this, there is no precedent for what's happening in Rome right now. No precedent whatsoever. The revolution of Vatican II has come out of the closet. And there are many good and faithful Catholics who now feel duty-bound in conscience to speak out against what is happening. Cardinal Burke being a great example of it. And to do so for the good of souls and for the integrity of the Church, because now we have massive contradictions between what the Church taught a few years ago and what the Church is teaching now. And the Church cannot contradict herself. One of them has to be wrong, because they're in direct contradiction with each other, old Church versus new. So people say, yeah, but you know, he who eats of the Pope dies of the Pope. Mange Papa, morte Papa. Or Rome has spoken, the matter is settled. Roma, what is it? Roma locuta est, causa finita est. But all of these things presuppose that the Pope was defending the faith. You can't criticize the Pope who's defending the faith for any reason. To question him, to resist him, was to imperil your soul when there was sanity still in the Vatican. But when the Pope undermines the faith, then what? Rome has spoken now, so we're supposed to be silent? Well, this can't be right. Faith and reason. Reason. Remember? Catholicism is fundamentally reasonable, which is why admonishing others to go along with Pope Francis after he contradicts his predecessors on a matter of faith and morals is illogical and anti-Catholic. It can't be that way. If the Pope, argues the great theologian Francis de Victoria, if the Pope wanted to destroy the Church, he should not be permitted to act in that fashion, but one would be obliged to resist him. The reason for this is that he does not possess power in order to destroy. Therefore, if there is evidence that he is doing so, it is lawful to resist him. The result of all this is that if the Pope, I stopped the quotation here to remind you, he's talking about a sitting pontiff, the Pope, not an anti-Pope, the Pope. The result of all this is that if the Pope destroys the Church by his orders and acts, he can be resisted and the execution of his mandates prevented, end quote. Again, he's talking about the Pope. And that's where we are now. And this is not easy. No one's enjoying this situation. If you sense that anybody is feeling vindicated by being able to tee off on Pope Francis, then turn off that station or stop reading that article. Because if you're not terrified by what's happening in the Vatican right now, you don't have the sensus Catholicus. You're not a Catholic either. This is extremely upsetting, or should be, to all faithful Catholics. What's happened? Someone has taken over our Church. We're in uncharted waters right now. This very well could be the chastisement, because it could lead to all sorts of doubts. Well, if the Church can change on fundamental issues of faith and morals, then infallibility doesn't really mean anything, so what other bill of goods have we been sold? Is the Church real? Did Christ really found it? Is there a God, ultimately, is where this leads, if it's not checked. Which, again, is why we should be so grateful to the princes of the Church who are standing up and trying to check it right now. We cannot allow our faith, in the meantime, to be shaken by what's happening in the Vatican. We need to prayerfully prepare, though, to survive bad days ahead, which does not mean we get all vitriolic and up in everybody's faces on the internet, telling them all how great we are. We got it all figured out. Pope Francis is the anti-pope. Pope Francis is the false prophet. How do you know? Again, Victoria, the theologian, is talking about a pope trying to destroy the Church, not an anti-pope. That's the Luciferian genius of this plot to destroy the Church. They're on the inside. They're home-growing their own from within the Church. And we can't desert the Church. It's not that easy just to declare that it's an anti-pope or whatever and desert the Church. Run off and hide somewhere. Start our own little church. Declare ourselves bishops and popes. We got to stay and fight. We got to stay and fight for Mother Church, who right now has been infiltrated by as far as I can tell, by enemies of the faith. And we're not here on this earth to save the Church. The Church is to save us. Our job is to keep the faith until God intervenes to save His Church. Archbishop Lefebvre and Castro Mayer and a lot of great men resisted this evil spirit in the Church in Vatican II 25, 35 years ago, 40 years ago. They were already resisting it. And today, competent authority in Cardinal Burke and the other cardinals and bishops are resisting it again. So we as lay people can be sure that we're on solid ground. Something is wrong, and we need to stand strong with those that are resisting it through the proper channels. Setting aside again the arrogant bombast of the know-it-all, putting ourselves in God's hands and asking Mary, our mother, to be with us now more than ever, because things are going to get very, very confusing. The truth is, we don't have all this figured out. There's mystery here. There's a war going on between good and evil. Nobody has it all figured out. And if anybody tells you that they do, I would dismiss them as a kook. But using our wits as Catholics, we do the best we can to resist and survive while trusting in Almighty God to do the rest. In closing, St. Vincent of Lerins, who was a confessor of the Church, way back in the 5th century, said the following, quote, "If some new contagion were to try to poison no longer a small part of the Church, but all of the Church at the same time, then he will take the greatest care to attach himself to antiquity, which obviously can no longer be seduced by any lying novelty," end quote. Lying novelty is what we face right now, ladies and gentlemen. So we need to pull out our beads, say our prayers, pray for Pope Francis like there's no tomorrow, hold your children close, and stand fast and hold to sacred tradition now more than ever. Don't forget about us down here if you want to support the Underground. The 50 Cent Club, I think, is advertised right up here. Don't forget also to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really helps us out a lot. Again, thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.